When archaeologist Howard Carter first peered into the newly discovered tomb of Tutankhamun, he had no idea what might lie within it. The treasure trove he'd unearthed was beyond his or any other archaeologist's wildest dreams. But the gold came at a price. Greed, conflict, and even death were to cloud the next 10 years as he and his team cleared the tomb, finally to reveal the face of the boy king himself.
One of the greatest and most dramatic moments in the whole history of archaeology was the moment when archaeologist Howard Carter, on the 26th of November 1922, turned to his patron, Lord Carnarvon, who'd asked him what could be seen through a small hole which had been dug into a newly discovered tomb here in the Valley of the Kings. "Can you see anything?" asked Carnarvon anxiously. "Yes," Carter is said to have replied. "Yes, wonderful things." Those three simple words are enough to conjure up all the romance and excitement of the most successful treasure hunt of all time. The hunt for a lost royal tomb, which took Carter and Carnarvon 5 long years and which had almost been abandoned at the last minute. Carter wrote of the day of days, the most wonderful that I have ever lived through. A wonderful day, wonderful things. Actually, like so many of the well-known stories associated with that newly discovered tomb, the one about wonderful things didn't quite happen like that. It started life about a year later with the official published version of events. At the time, Lord Carnarvon remembered Carter as saying, "There are some marvellous objects in here," while Carter himself, in his journal entry for that day of days, recalls saying, "Yes, it's wonderful." Anyway, whatever was actually said, Carter immediately set about enlarging that small hole which was in the sealed door. And then, accompanied by Lord Carnarvon, Lady Evelyn Herbert, Carnarvon's daughter, and Arthur Callender, an engineer and long-standing friend of Carter's, he clambered down into the antechamber of the tomb. As they all squeezed through the hole in the door, the sight which greeted them took their breath away.
Uncanny beasts, enough to look upon at any time. Their brilliant gilded surfaces picked out of the darkness by our electric torch, their heads throwing grotesque, distorted shadows on the wall behind them, they were almost terrifying. Next, on the right, 2 statues caught and held our attention. 2 life-size figures of a king in black, facing each other like sentinels, gold-kilted, armed with mace and staff.
Nothing so complete had ever been found in Egypt before. Having recovered from the excitement and resealed the small hole in the door, the party returned here to Castle Carter overlooking the Valley of the Kings. Hundreds of questions flooded in on their minds. What might lie beyond that sealed door? Would there be a long passageway like the other royal tombs in the valley, or a series of small chambers, each with its own sealed door? Had the tomb been plundered? Were they absolutely certain there was a tomb there at all? And were there wonderful treasures to behold in addition to the things they'd already seen? Well, says Carter, the solutions to those mysteries would simply have to wait until the official opening in the presence of high-ranking Egyptians. So the party would just have to be incredibly patient. Research into the archives certainly supports the fact that not much sleep was had that night. but suggests that the reason there wasn't much sleep is that the party decided, probably right here in this very room, to go back to the tomb that same night to take a secret look at all the chambers for themselves. What may have happened in the tomb after that is still a matter of heated debate and controversy among historians.
What exactly did Howard Carter and his party do when they re-entered the tomb? Well, the first thing was closely to inspect the contents of the antechamber, which Carter in his notebook likened to the property room of an opera of a vanished civilization. A confused mess of wooden and gilded parts from 6 chariots. Under the gilt couches, painted and inlaid caskets, chairs, pottery jars, as well as a golden throne. Then they confirmed that, as Carter had feared, someone had broken into the tomb in antiquity. A small opening into what came to be called the annex could be seen beneath one of the animal couches. And between the 2 guardian figures on the north wall, there was another sealed door which had also been breached. Now, there's no doubt that Carter reopened the robber's hole and that he, Carnarvon and Lady Evelyn squeezed even further into the tomb to see the burial chamber, almost completely filled with a huge golden shrine. Behind the shrine was a 4th open chamber, which they called the storeroom or treasury. As Carter said, "I've got Tutankhamun, that is certain." Then they left the tomb, covering the telltale hole in the wall with a basket and some reeds, and, it has been alleged, quietly removing some small objects, which has been called an act of archaeological vandalism.
Whatever the truth of the allegations, and Carter's papers about that night and the morning after are strangely confused about the order of events, it has to be said that the secret re-entry into the tomb and even the removal of 1 or 2 objects needn't necessarily have had sinister motives. Consider, from his own experience, Carter had to be absolutely certain that there was something significant beyond that door before he went public. Equally, Carnarvon and Carter expected to receive some share of the contents of the tomb in recompense for their investment and their labour, so they may have thought that the removal of 1 or 2 objects on account, as it were, was not unreasonable. Or they may have wanted to bring the objects back here to study them in their own time at leisure, which could explain why a small perfume box from the tomb was clearly seen on Carter's table some time before the official opening of the chamber from which it was removed. Above all, it's as well to remember that the ethics of archaeology and the whole way in which archaeological digs were conducted were very, very different some 70 years ago. In any case, at the time, Carter had far too much on his mind to agonise about the finer points of ethics.
Only 2 days later, the official opening of the tomb of Tutankhamun took place. The Times report, published the following day, was the very first to make public the news of this staggering discovery. It was to start a rush of journalists, tourists, and other archaeologists, many of whom were employed by New York's Metropolitan Museum. Letters and telegrams poured in.
One welcome cable of congratulation came from Albert Lithgow, curator of the Egyptian department at the Metropolitan Museum in New York. Carter was quick to reply. "Thanks message, discovery colossal and need every assistance. Stop. Could you consider loan of Burton in recording in time being? Stop. Costs to us. Every regards, Carter, Caro." The reply to this one came back almost immediately. "Only too delighted to assist in every possible way. Stop. Please call upon Burton and any other members of our staff. Stop." It was a very generous offer, and it helped to bond Carter to the Met, a museum which would benefit greatly from this relationship in years to come. Other offers of help flooded in as Carter and Carnarvon began to assemble the greatest team of archaeological experts the world had ever seen.
It included Harry Burton of the Met, responsible for photographing every stage of the tomb's clearance. The museum also provided Arthur Mace, assistant curator and expert record keeper, and 2 architectural draftsmen. From elsewhere came a chemist and conservator, an historian and a philologist. The team had no idea at that stage of the enormity of the task confronting them. Lord Carnarvon wrote of the many weeks of work ahead of Carter. In fact, the recording and the mapping and the drawing and the photographing and the conserving of the many thousands of objects to be found within the tomb was to take all of 10 years. A routine was quickly established with the antechamber. Each object or group of objects was given a reference number. In the case of the Golden Throne, it was number 91. And it was photographed in situ with or without the reference number in shot. Each object was then located on a ground plan and given a brief description written by Howard Carter or Arthur Mace on a numbered reference card, sometimes with a drawing in pencil or ink to help with the details of visual identification. This particular drawing of the throne by Howard Carter is clear and accurate, and although it was done on the spot at great speed, still useful. Each object was then taken over to the laboratory tomb for cleaning and conservation and to be rephotographed against a neutral background before being shipped off to Cairo. No wonder Carter sometimes thought and even wrote there was more to be done than any human agency could accomplish. The sheer enormity of the operation was without precedent, and the burden of responsibility was a heavy one. Harry Burton's great photographs taken inside the tomb are justly famous. But what's less well known is that he also shot a great deal of movie footage outside the tomb, which has seldom been seen since 1923. This rare archive film shows that in February 1923, the tomb was just like a stage set, with the audience waiting for the performance to begin. The discoveries were being given more worldwide publicity than anything ever in the history of science. Almost overnight, Carter and Carnarvon became international celebrities.
The tomb draws like a magnet. Around the top of the upper level of the tomb there is a low wall, and here they stake a claim, waiting for something to happen. We are really alarmed sometimes that the whole wall might give way and a crowd of visitors be precipitated into the mouth of the tomb.
It was only a matter of time before all this hype began to get in the way of the painstaking work of scholarship and conservation which Carter and his team were trying to continue, often in sweltering conditions. It had taken 7 weeks to clear the antechamber, and on the 17th of February 1923, everything was ready for the official opening of the next chamber and the solution of the mystery of what lay beyond the sealed door. Carter and Carnarvon, of course, secretly knew the solution already. Carter stepped onto the wooden platform, stripped to his vest, and struck the first blow with his chisel. It took him nearly 2 hours to make a hole big enough for the assembled company to enter. Beyond the sealed door was the huge golden box built to cover and protect the royal sarcophagus, and the first thing they saw of it, as Carter had seen more than 3 months before, was a pair of protective eyes staring back at them. The strains of work, the deception, not to mention entertaining groups of dignitaries who by now were queuing up. The strains had been tremendous, and it was agreed that the team should close the tomb and take a few days off. Carter locked himself in his house at the entrance of the valley, did his best to discourage visitors, and contemplated his future.
Relations between him and Lord Carnarvon had reached breaking point, and a peacemaking letter written by Carnarvon to Carter at this time reveals how, amid all the stresses and strains, their working partnership had been developing into a very close friendship.
I have no doubt that I have done many foolish things, and I'm very sorry. But there is only one thing I want to say to you. Whatever your feelings are, or will be for me in the future, my affection for you will never change. I'm a man of few friends, and whatever happens, nothing will alter my feelings for you. I could not rest until I had written to you.
There's no record of Carter's reply, and Carnarvon was far too busy negotiating in Cairo and elsewhere to discuss such personal matters in the privacy they deserved.
If there was one thing which transformed the story of an archaeological dig into one of the great melodramas of the day, it was what happened next. Before he left for Cairo, Lord Carnarvon was bitten on the left cheek by an insect, most probably a mosquito. The following morning, while he was shaving here in a suite of rooms at the Winter Palace Hotel, Luxor, he accidentally nicked the head off the small pimple which had formed. By the time he reached Cairo, his entire face had begun to ache, the glands on his neck had swelled up, and he was beginning to run a very high temperature. His doctor advised him to be very careful about what he ate and drank, and as far as possible to rest in bed, advice which Carnarvon coolly swept aside. He continued to drink good bottles of claret, which had been shipped over from the cellars at Highclere, and even to go to the cinema, where he watched a film right through to the end, even though by now he was seriously and visibly ill. Lady Evelyn Herbert wrote to Carter expressing her concern. The old man, she said, is feeling just too rotten for words, and he's confined to his bed. This was followed by an urgent telegram explaining that the situation had become grave. Carter rushed to Cairo to be at his friend's bedside. Lady Carnarvon was summoned from England, and the patient was heard to murmur, "I have heard the call. I am preparing." His whole body weakened by blood poisoning, the 57-year-old Earl had succumbed to pneumonia, and in the early hours of April the 5th, 1923, he passed away.
Where the journalists were concerned, Carnarvon's death gave the Tutankhamun story a whole new lease of life. Tales of the curse of the mummy, of Tut's revenge, began to hit the headlines. Lord Carnarvon's embalmed body was returned to the grounds of Highclere Castle and buried here on Beacon Hill, a burial place of the ancient Britons. If ever there was an untimely death, this was it. Carter had not only lost a close friend and patron, he'd been left on his own to deal with an increasingly tense political situation. With the tomb closed over the hot summer months, he persuaded Lady Carnarvon to continue with the concession, but the second season was all set to be even more difficult than the first. To add to Carter's problems, there were riots and demonstrations on the streets as the nationalists and their recently formed political party struggled to make their country independent of the protection of Britain. The result was that the wider context of Egyptian archaeology changed forever, and the Tutankhamun excavation was at the center of that change. In future, they'd be working by courtesy of the Egyptian government, who'd expect all the finest antiquities to go to Cairo. In October 1923, the first post-Carnarvon season was ready to start. But a by now constant stream of official visitors interrupted their work, and Carter was under increasing pressure from the Antiquities Department, under its outspoken director, Pierre Lecoux, to knuckle under to their way of managing affairs relating to the tomb. The first challenge was to open the great gilded shrine.
the guardian statues had to be carefully removed and a whole of the north partition wall demolished. Once inside, Carter slid back the ebony bolts to reveal a second shrine. Only this time, the seal of Tutankhamun was unbroken. Finally, protected by no less than 4 massive shrines, there was the yellow sarcophagus itself, carved from a solid block of the hardest quartzite. The task of dismantling and shifting the 4 shrines, which disassembled into 51 separate sections, took far longer than expected.
After our scaffolding and hoisting tackle had been introduced, it occupied practically all the available space. We bumped our heads, nipped our fingers. We had to squeeze in and out like weasels and work in all kinds of embarrassing positions.
Eventually, by February 1924, the whole world was waiting for the granite lid of the sarcophagus to be lifted. As Egyptian officials and members of the team stood in silence, the lifting tackle took the strain.
A huge slab, weighing over 1.25 tons, rose from its bed. A sight met our eyes that at first puzzled us. The contents were completely covered by dark linen shrouds. We rolled back these covering shrouds, and a gasp of wonderment escaped our lips. A golden effigy of the young boy king.
Carter's plan, after the formal opening, was to allow the wives of his colleagues into the tomb to have a private view of the king. But the newly appointed Minister of Public Works in Egypt, a well-known nationalist, had been imprisoned for treason by the British a few years before. He took a deep dislike to Carter as a person, an Englishman, and as a walking symbol of imperialism.
So in response to Carter's request, he refused to allow the ladies into the tomb. Why should they go in, he argued, before the wives of Egyptian dignitaries or even cabinet ministers? And by sending an armed column of policemen on camels and horses across the river to the Valley of the Kings to make sure that his instructions were fully carried out. Carter, by now so nervous and exhausted that he was said to be scarcely in control of himself, met with his team here in the bar at the Winter Palace Hotel to decide noisily and publicly on his best course of action.
In the heat of the moment, he dictated a furious statement.
Owing to the impossible restrictions and discourtesies on the part of the Public Works Department and its Antiquities Service, all my collaborators in protest have refused to work any further. I am therefore obliged to make known to the public that the tomb will be closed and no further work carried out. Signed, Howard Carter.
By refusing to continue work at the tomb, Carter had in fact infringed the terms of the Carnarvon concession, and so it was duly cancelled. The first strike and lockout in the history of archaeology put Tutankhamun back into the world's headlines. Officials, backed up by soldiers, forced the tomb open again. The resulting public row left it in some doubt whether Carter would ever work in Egypt again. When the officials then searched through the material left by Carter and his team, they found another apparent irregularity.
A commission of Egyptians from the Antiquities Department, headed by Pierre Lecow, was preparing an inventory of all the materials used by Carter and his team while they were in the valley. And in one of the storage tombs, known as the lunch tomb, tucked away in a wooden box, they found a beautiful wooden painted sculpture of a boy's head emerging from a sacred lotus flower of the Nile. The strange case of the Fortnum and Mason's wine box was about to begin. Strange because the sculpture wasn't labelled or docketed or numbered, while all the other treasures they found were covered in identifying labels. Carter was usually meticulous about such things. Had Carter been intending surreptitiously to remove the piece from the tomb in its very British box? Was it his own personal property which he'd brought to the tomb for reference purposes? Eventually, Carter explained in a coded telegram from London that he'd found the sculpture, which by the way was of the boy king Tutankhamun himself, in the entrance passageway, and that in all the excitement of subsequent finds, he'd omitted to put it in his index. Lacour was satisfied with this and whisked the piece off to the Cairo Museum. But lingering doubts remained. How on earth had Carter managed to forget about so important, even capital a piece? And why didn't he mention it in any of his writings or statements when much lesser pieces got a great deal of space? The strange case of the Fortnum and Mason's wine box was to follow Carter around as, on April the 12th, he left for a major lecture tour of the United States of America.
His reception in New York, the first stop in a grueling whistle-stop schedule covering 18 cities in the States and Canada, was rapturous. Lecture halls were filled to capacity, and there was even an invitation to the White House to meet President Calvin Coolidge and give a private performance. At Yale University, he was awarded an honorary doctorate of science, the only academic recognition he was ever to be given. In city after city, journalists queued up to hear his stories. A new phase in his career was beginning. Carter, the international celebrity. In public, he seemed to be in excellent spirits, but he was still very worried about the mess he'd left behind. Back in Egypt, the struggle for national self-determination had led to more unrest and anti-British feeling. Against this background, there were attempts to find a replacement for Carter, but no one was prepared to accept the job, or maybe no one actually wanted it. So Carter was invited back, but the exact deal required a lot of goodwill on both sides.
By the time Carter returned here to Cairo in December 1924, things had simmered down a little, but there was still an almighty row going on about the exact circumstances in which he'd be permitted to continue his work. Would the objects from the tomb be shared out between the museum and the sponsor? Or instead of that, would the Carnarvon estate be financially recompensed? Or would the Egyptian government be entitled to everything, the most likely outcome? But in the end, with the choice of a new, and from the British point of view, more cooperative Prime Minister, Ziwar Pasha, who'd been very friendly to Carter in the past, a fresh concession was granted. But as Carter mournfully noted, the tomb had become a center of political intrigue and a worldwide advertisement for the tourist and hotel companies of Egypt. And that, in the end, was probably what swung it.
The tomb was handed back with great pomp and circumstance on the 25th of January 1925, a grand send-off to what promised at last to be a settled season of work. As the tomb was being cleared, the team could hear the cracks and creaks of objects adjusting to the new environmental conditions. There were inscribed and painted boxes and chests, crammed full of delicate fabrics, jewellery and cosmetics. The king's favourite things buried with him in the belief that his spirit could enjoy them second time around in the afterlife. Perhaps to the sound of his military trumpets, which after restoration could still be played. There were hundreds of small articles of clothing, such as rush sandals, which almost fell apart to the touch. There were even more fragile linen gloves. There were dried wreaths of flowers, which, like the fabrics, had to be stabilized and conserved with paraffin wax before they could be moved, a great test for the early science of conservation.
It's a tribute to chemist Alfred Lucas that of the many thousands of objects found, only 1/4% of them were lost. Without on-the-spot preliminary conservation, Carter estimated, barely 10% of the objects would have been fit for public display. But even during this relentlessly detailed work, they continued to be amazed by the beauty of the objects. When the two main chambers had been cleared, it was time to tackle the delicate operation of raising and opening the nest of coffins within the sarcophagus. On the 13th of October 1925, the second coffin was revealed. When the lid of this coffin was raised, a third one was seen, covered with a reddish shroud and garlands of flowers.
An astounding fact was disclosed. The third coffin, 6 feet 1 3/4 of an inch in length, was made of solid gold. Its weight was as much as 8 strong men could lift. An enormous mass of pure bullion. The face of this gold coffin was again that of the king.
At 9:45 a.m. on the 11th of November 1925, a solemn group of Egyptian officials gathered around the golden coffin to witness the final opening and the revealing of the mummy itself. Carter found inside the coffin a black, resinous substance which fixed the mummy firmly in place. But what claimed everyone's attention was the golden image of the king.
The mask, a beautiful and unique specimen of ancient portraiture, bears a sad but calm expression, suggestive of youth overtaken prematurely by death. Upon its forehead were the royal insignia, the vulture and the serpent, emblems of the 2 kingdoms over which he had reigned.
For the next 8 days, the work of dislodging the mummy and removing the linen wrappings was carried out in almost complete silence. A coating of melted paraffin wax was painted over the delicate, powdery outer layer. Once this was dry, an incision was made down the center of the outer binding, and the wrappings were peeled back, revealing layer after layer of symbolic jewels and amulets which had been bandaged in with the royal mummy. As each stage in the unwrapping process was reached, Carter made drawings of the exact position of each piece of jewelry on the king's head and neck, body and arms. In all, a staggering 97 separate groups of objects. But in the process of unwrapping all of this beauty and wealth, Carter and his team had to burn, cut through, and chisel the pitch-like substance which held everything together, and even to dismember the corpse itself. Their devouring passion for all the treasures evidently outweighed their interest in the human remains. Forcing the mask from the dismembered face seems today to have been the final indignity. The pathetic remains of the boy king had to be put back together again and laid out on a sand tray for Harry Burton to photograph them. The following summer 1926, Howard Carter returned to England to recover from the strains and responsibilities of his great project. Meanwhile, here at Highclere Castle, Lady Carnarvon was busy preparing to auction off the entire contents of her late husband's collection of antiquities. Indeed, it was said that she was still so upset that she forbade anyone to utter the dreaded name of Tutankhamun anywhere on the estate. Now, in his will, Lord Carnarvon had suggested that Howard Carter be made negotiator or consultant in the event of a sale, and he tried hard to persuade Lady Carnarvon to cancel the public auction and to enter into private negotiations with the British Museum in London for some giveaway sum. In the end, the entire collection was sold to the Metropolitan Museum in New York for the princely sum of $145,000. Now, it seems that when the collection was housed here at Highclere, a few of the objects bore the name or the royal markings of Tutankhamun, but by the time the collection was shipped over to New York, they'd been quietly removed, presumably in order to avoid embarrassment to all concerned. Perhaps this was the reason why Lord Carnarvon had been so insistent that Carter be named as negotiator. And perhaps it was also the reason why certain members of staff at the Met insisted on referring to the Carnarvon collection as a pocket collection. All these complex arrangements took some time, and when they were over, Howard Carter was quite ready to return to the next season back in the Valley of the Kings. The 1926 season began with an unemotional entry in Carter's diary.
The outermost coffin containing the king's mummy, finally rewrapped, was lowered into the sarcophagus this morning. We are now ready to begin the investigation of the storeroom, or treasury.
This small room off the east wall of the burial chamber was to contain some of the most wonderful things of all.
Immediately in front of the entrance lay the figure of the jackal god Anubis upon his shrine, swathed in linen and resting upon a portable sled. Facing the doorway on the farther side stood the most beautiful monument I have ever seen. The central portion of it consisted of a large shrine-shaped chest, completely overlaid with gold. Surrounding this, freestanding, were statues of the 4 tutelary goddesses of the dead, gracious figures, with outstretched protective arms, so natural and lifelike in their pose, so pitiful and compassionate that one felt it almost sacrilege to look at them. There were also distributed in different quarters of the chamber a seemingly endless number of shrine-shaped boxes and chests.
One of these boxes, undecorated and unobtrusive, contained 2 miniature coffins, inside which were 2 mummified fetuses, both probably female, of about 5 and 7 months gestation. Great care had been lavished on these tiny premature babies. It seemed probable that they were the children of Tutankhamun and his wife Amen-tut-ankh, and in the case of the older baby, that the child had a spina bifida condition. The next season, 1927-8, was taken up with clearing the annex, another small storeroom, this time off the antechamber. It was to be a complex, nerve-wracking process, made worse by the tomb robbers of antiquity who seemed to have ransacked the place. The work proceeded steadily and methodically, but at some cost to Carter's health. Working in the confined space of the tomb for so long was to mean that he was seldom well again for the rest of his life.
By the 1930 season, when Carter returned to the tomb, his moods were beginning to get more volatile and depressed, and the incessant physical strain was beginning to show in a series of heavy colds. He was even beginning to get officious and short with the workforce, which was unusual for him because ever since he came to Egypt, he got on better with the workforce than almost anyone else in the community of archaeologists, and they'd repaid his loyalty with theirs through thick and thin. But now he could write bitterly, "It seems to me they get more stupid as they get older, and slacker too, having been perhaps too long with me." His notes and diaries at the time are full of other complaints as well, about Egyptian officials breathing down his neck, about the fact that the tomb was now officially open for 3 days a week to tourists, and about the sheer hard grind of the work. The period of discovery was over. The period of routine conservation work was going to last for 2 more years. As a visitor to the tomb in 1930 wrote, "I do pity him cooped up for 7 years in the electrified darkness of that tomb."
In February 1932, Howard Carter's colossal task finally came to an end. It had taken far longer than anyone imagined 10 years before. Without the support and expertise of the Metropolitan Museum and the scientific skills of Alfred Lucas, it could never have been done at all. Carter was by now the most famous archaeologist in the world, thanks to the newspapers and to his 3-volume story of the discovery of the tomb. But he never managed to write or even start the detailed scholarly report which everyone expected of him. Somehow, when the physical work was done, his heart was no longer in it. The pace of his life changed dramatically. He'd spend days on his own here at Castle Carter. Sometimes he'd cross the Nile to the Winter Palace Hotel and sit by himself in the entrance hall, deep in thought. He would buttonhole passers-by like the ancient mariner with stories of better times. By now, he was a sick man diagnosed as suffering from Hodgkin's disease, a form of cancer. Even painting and the natural world failed to excite or console him anymore, and Egypt had long since lost its romance for him. With less and less reason to visit Luxor and the Valley of the Kings, Howard Carter eventually came back to England and settled in a large London apartment here at Albert Court, South Kensington, overlooking the Royal Albert Hall. From this late Victorian building, he operated as a gentleman dealer, buying and selling Oriental carpets and ancient Egyptian antiquities, with some success, judging by the rows he had with the Inland Revenue.
Although there were rumours of close personal attachments with a Frenchwoman living in King's Cross, or was it Norfolk, with a young man from West London, or was it the Valley of the Kings, Carter, in fact, lived here alone, and there's no conclusive evidence for any close association, male or female, throughout his life. He seems to have been the sort of person who was much better at making friends rather than keeping them, and he even kept his distance from his own family. All that is, except his brother William and his sister Amy, whose only child Phyllis became a very special favourite during his final years.
His life revolved around the grill room at the Hyde Park Hotel, where he usually dined alone, his favourite clubs, the Chelsea Arts Club, the Savile and the Arts Club, and fashionable dinner parties or country house weekends, where he entertained the guests with well-honed tales of Tutankhamun.
By early 1939, Howard Carter's failing health required the attentions of a full-time nurse. Phyllis, too, looked in regularly, but the end was approaching fast. He died here in his Albert Court apartment on March the 2nd, 1939, after a painful and miserable illness. Shortly before he died, he'd recorded one of his lectures for the BBC. It's the only known evidence of what his voice sounded like. All trace of a regional accent, the Carter background, had by now been thoroughly wiped out.
"33 centuries had passed since human feet last trod the floor on which we stood, and yet the signs of recent life were around us. A blackened lamp, a half-filled bowl of mortar. We had penetrated 2 chambers, but when we came to a golden shrine with doors closed and sealed, we realized that we were in the presence of the dead king. I suppose most excavators would confess to a feeling of awe when they break into a tomb closed and sealed by pious hands so many centuries ago.
When he was buried here at Putney Vale Cemetery, South London, with a ceremony which couldn't have been further removed from the pomp and the splendour of the ancient Egyptian funerals he discovered so much about, not a single senior Egyptologist or museum curator or government official came to see him off. Even after his death, the obituaries continued to go on about the curse and insisted on quoting that fictional tomb inscription, "Death shall come on swift wings to whoever toucheth the tomb of a pharaoh." Now, if he'd been in a position to reply, Howard Carter would no doubt have repeated, and loudly, the choice phrase he sometimes used to people who got things spectacularly wrong. The answer to that is spherical and in the plural. He may not have been a scholar or a member of the right social class, but in the public eye, Howard Carter remained the most famous archaeologist of all. The man who hunted and discovered the great tomb with its buried treasure. A discovery that fired and still fires the imagination of all who look into the face of Tutankhamun.